Okay, thank you, Melanie, for jumping on a Sunday morning. We can go over this. We'll have a wonderful video leave behind. This is a run through for us. If you are watching this, this is a practice for tomorrow's Open UI CSS Working Group joint meeting that will be occurring on October 12th, just in case, 2020, just in case you're watching this in like 2028 or whatever. Anyways, hopefully form controls will be better by then. At any rate, I am Greg Whitworth. I am a product owner on Salesforce for the platform team for Lightning Web Components and Lightning Application Services. And I work very closely with the design system team, base components team. And that is who I am. Melanie.
Hi, I'm Melanie Richards. I work for Microsoft on the Microsoft Edge web platform team. So I have a background in design and development and, super interested in thinking more deeply about controls on the web.
All right, well, cool. So we will, oh, my keyboard isn't working. Yay.
Technology.
Yeah, so we won't go through this agenda for the sake of the agenda. I mean, you're more than welcome to take breaks and then discuss things for afterwards, but we won't go through this. So we'll jump right into the problem. Melanie, kick us off.
Yeah, so as Greg mentioned, we want to start with, why are we here today? What are we actually trying to solve with this discussion on customizable control UI? So next slide, please. So each, browser implementer has put a lot of thought and care into the controls that they ship on their implementation. So for example, here on the slide are a bunch of controls from the Chromium refresh that we did, Microsoft and Google in 2019. And so these are several different, controls that are rendered in Windows high contrast mode. And so, we put like a lot of thought into how do the controls integrate with various assistive technologies, how do they match a modern aesthetic that feels good in context, how do we manage the user behavior of more complex controls like the, date pickers and color pickers, that sort of thing. But for all of the user research and work that goes into these controls, we find that developers are actually recreating them, kind of throwing these away and then creating them from scratch. So in this slide on the left-hand side, we have two select controls that have basically been rebuilt from the ground up using divs. And behaviorally, they're actually not very different. You have this little button that has the current selected value and an arrow. You click on that, it drops down a list of text-based options. So it's pretty much the same, but just to get that arrow glyph that the developer wanted, as well as their brand color scheme, they just rewrote the entire control. So that's a lot of work just for a minor difference. And then there are cases where the developer actually really does need more extensibility in the content and the behaviors of a control. So on the other side of the slide, we have an example of, an airline date picker where you want two different dates and they kind of span across, months. And so that is not, something that's easily achievable with the native inbuilt control. So next slide. And so we wanted to, kind of understand how often are web developers recreating these form controls? Why are they doing this? We really wanted to be data-driven in our approach. So for Greg and I, we come from, a design, development shop background. And so we know from our own personal experiences, we've had to struggle with this ourselves. This is an old problem, but we want to understand, really, is this acutely felt across the industry and to what degree? So we did a survey with about 1,400 folks, and we found that the primary reason that people are recreating these controls is simply because they couldn't change the appearance sufficiently. So 36.6% of respondents are, oh, I just can't, barely can't make this match my brand, that sort of thing. We found that 31.6% of people wanted to add functionality. And then, the third most common reason that people recreate these is browser inconsistencies. So that's 27.3% of respondents. And as we discussed today, we'll find that interoperability really like crops up again and again as, kind of a major developer pain point. Next slide. And so when we kind of observe like what are the top controls that are recreated by web developers, we see some trends here. So select is the most commonly recreated control at 10.7%. And then from there, we get into checkbox, date, radio, file, progress, and then on down to button, dialog, text area, and even the text input. So these are cases where, you might want to strongly match your brand, or you might have, a little bit like more robust user experience that you want to inject, like maybe, in the file control. Next slide. And so, we didn't just hear this, from our survey participants. We also talked to various different component libraries and frameworks that represent, like some of the world's largest, companies. And we found that these folks are struggling with like the same exact kinds of problems where, I just barely can't do this thing with the, HTML like native control. I have to like recreate this thing. And now I have like all these like headaches and like behavioral things that I have to track and implement on my own. So next slide. And, like that's something that we really kind of want to hammer home is that, it's not just about like, okay, they're recreating controls, sure, like that's just the state of the world. No, it's actually causing real developer pain as people are going throughout this process. Next slide. So some of the most frustrating form controls, again, you have like that select really popping up to the top. 42.7% of folks found this one the most frustrating, and date, that's there as well. You want to have a lot more control over that, and you're just kind of leaving it up to the gods, so to speak, when you use the native control. File, checkbox, radio, a lot of the same controls are bubbling up here. Next slide. And, other surveys kind of back up, some of these phenomena as well. So the MDN Web DNA survey 2019 results kind of pointed at some like top HTML pain points. And while there were folks that, were like, I don't really have top pain points, or, lack of adoption is most painful for me, we did see like strong resonance with control customizability here. So 26.7% at inability to customize components built into HTML. Folks also had pain points around the quality of components or not enough components. So, are we leaving gaps such as tabs, or Apple brought up, a font picker control that could be really useful. And then again, there's that lack of interoperability between implementations that is causing developer pain points. Next slide. And so, if you spend any time on web dev Twitter, like you can't avoid seeing complaints about controls. So one of our DevRel folks at Microsoft, Stephanie Simic, asked, I would rather blank than attempt to style a native select control, element. And people were asked to like kind of fill in the blank there. There are some very funny responses here. So one person said, I would rather breakdance barefoot on a pile of logos. Someone else said they'd rather call each person attempting to use the form and ask what option they would like. All right, that sounds like very taxing process. And then someone else would rather build the entire site in Flash. So a lot of like desperation coming through here from folks. Next slide. And Scott Deal kind of like captures it perfectly, this problem. So he says, you have one problem. You want icons in your select menu options. And he says, you decide to make a custom select menu. Have at least 75 problems. So that is sometimes how it feels. Next slide. Just the other day, we actually found, a thread kind of bubbling up in the feed. Dan Cederholm had mentioned, just emerged from styling an input type equals range with CSS. And my God, is it even worth the insane trouble? Web design is so much harder than it needs to be. And you get responses like, best 700 lines of CSS, built myself a little house to cry in, and like, hey, we should have a support group for people who have, gone through this. So it's causing a lot of developer pain here. Next slide. So we wanted to find out, like just how much of an opportunity we had, when it comes to addressing this problem. And so if you could just click once. Yes, thank you. So we wanted to talk with, a wide variety of folks. We use, and when I say we here, I mean Microsoft. So we worked with our user research pros to recruit folks across designers, full stack, front end. And then we also kind of leaned upon our large Twitter presence to talk to other designers and developers as well. And so, yeah, what we're really trying to drive that in an opportunity analysis is like, how big of an impact could we make? Next slide. So we ask questions like, how satisfied are you with the experience of fully styling the Select pop-up window on desktop? And how important is it for you to be able to fully style the Select pop-up window on desktop? And we ask like these same sorts of questions across like various different controls and the entire like control space, just like as a general bucket. And what we're really trying to get, is like kind of like the cross between the importance and like the current pain and like how much there is there to fix. And so when you grade like an opportunity analysis, you're really looking for a score on a range from 1 to 20. So 1 means like, there's nothing here that we should really go and solve. 20 is like the world's most urgent problems. And then anything 10 and above is like, hey, there's a really great problem that we could go and solve here. And we could really like drive like web developer joy and a great experience for developers. So next slide. So we actually found that like across the 4 different dimensions that we asked about, there was actually a great problem to solve. So, folks find it important to change the appearance. They're having a hard time doing that. The frequency, rebuilding controls or restyling controls is something that's happening quite often. It's not like just a problem that crops up every so often. It's also a very effortful challenge here to recreate one's own controls. And then interop, again, is really bubbling to the top here with a score of 15.23. And so anything that we do to address the customizable controls problem has to be interoperable in order for it to be valuable for the web developer community. Next slide. Yeah, and so it's not just about like, the developer experience or ergonomics and how challenging that is. Like this process is actually also creating user experience issues. That's the next slide. Going back to the original Microsoft survey results, we found that many web developers are actually not testing for accessibility. So you have 31.2% of folks saying like, no, I don't test. You have 20% who do. Yes. And then you have another 48% who didn't respond to the question. And we can kind of surmise that some of those folks are not testing and kind of felt bad about saying that on a survey. So, this is a really unfortunate phenomenon and something I've kind of seen come to bear in like my own personal experience. We didn't learn about accessibility in school. For graphic design. And so you have like a lot of folks who are entering the workforce and have to like very quickly like try and get this, expertise built up and hopefully they come across the right resources and people to do that. And that's, a larger issue that, requires some other solutions as well. But, can we do a better job by these web developers in that like the native inbuilt controls are good enough and extensible enough and flexible enough that they don't have to like go in the weeds of like recreating all these accessible behaviors again. They can just lean on, the controls as they are. So next slide. So this really is kind of bearing out in accessibility issues in the wild. So, we kind of took a gander at some of the, these like top sites and found, a variety of, keyboard support or integration with assistive technologies and, just kind of exposing the semantics correctly or not. And, it's like there are some cases where there are like clear issues And then there are other cases where, it seems that the developer did, tests with assistive technologies, but the experience is inconsistent. So, where one site, where like a keyboard user might expect to traverse through options in, a button select menu using like their arrow keys, one site might, have those as tab stops. And then so like one individual user has to like relearn how to use a control from site to site, even if it basically looks the same on those different sites. And that's like a user experience problem that we could avoid with our native controls and making them more flexible. Next slide. And this isn't just accessibility. There's also kind of a bit of patchiness in browser testing during development. So I think like implementers and standards designers have kind of a concept of like what browsers a developer should include in their testing matrix, and we find that actually this is quite uneven. There are some browsers that are getting a lot of testing work happening, and then others that are maybe not being observed as much by web developers, and this might be introducing some user experience problems as well. So basically we're concerned that by recreating controls so often, we're kind of putting the onus on individual people to recreate these and get everything right. And we're seeing that there's a lot of developer pain. We're seeing that there's user experience pain. And so we think that this is a really important problem that we should tackle. I've been talking about controls for a while, but I haven't hit on a definition. So I'd love to kick it off to Greg to kind of dive into that a little bit more. You're muted, Greg. A classic of video calls.
Yeah, we can't have one without that. And what's funny is when I muted it, I was like, I like literally 4 slides ago, I was like, make sure to unmute. But then you passed me the baton and I didn't. So anyways, okay, well, perfect. That'll be in the video now. At any rate, what is a control? When we started looking at kind of investigating this space, it's one of those things where it's very easy for everybody to just implicitly like know what a control is. And for this entire deck, we're going to use the most frustrated of controls as kind of like the canonical example. And so on the screen right now is a select control that actually has its pop-up open. But as we like looked around the landscape, there actually is already an implicit definition. It's just not actually fully standardized on the web platform currently. Every single control that currently ships inside of a browser natively actually follows the MVC model. And so basically that is kind of how we're going to be using to talk about the proposals that we're going to set forth later to hopefully solve some of the use cases so that to the problem statement that Melanie put forth can be solved. But already hanging off of every type of element, there is effectively a model. There are properties that you can adjust and change, whether it be states, whether it be values, whether it be validity. But then they also all have a controller code as well. So like when you think about that select that we showed prior, like there is a button. So like the select to the browser has a known notion of what it takes to invoke its open states to then reveal the options, to then allow a selection of 0 to n options, depending on whether or not there's a multiple. And then when you select that, that updates the value model, right? And then the view, of course, is the user interface, the thing that the end user is interacting with and providing that input and that selection to update the model. And so ultimately, again, even though there isn't actually a standard definition somewhere, all of them follow this model. And I kind of want to like re-emphasize that of it is actually already there. We just haven't standardized it. And it's a very interesting aspect because of the fact that the whole point of this meeting, in my opinion, is to kind of like level set everybody on the web platform as much as possible and really put together a holistic plan of how we're going to think about controls and components. And so because this exists, when we started kind of going after this problem space, we really wanted to be like, okay, what is a control? What is it? And so effectively, we've landed on a definition that we'll use throughout the deck of a control is a type of component that manages user interaction. The controller has controller code that manages changes in the component states, and it's modeled based on the user interaction with its parts. And technically, within these controls and these components, there's a spectrum of customization that we can unlock. And this is again where, interestingly enough, the web platform already has this spectrum. This isn't something new. It's something that already exists, and we're just trying to like define it. We're trying to put labels to these. And I feel like this is super valuable for us to do. Try to bucketize like the capabilities that we're unlocking and the use cases along this spectrum that we unlock, because ultimately, as we saw in the problem statement that Melanie outlined, is the key goal here that we're trying to achieve is as many web developers and web properties to use what's built in, so they're not having to recreate, so that we have a great user experience for all of our shared users. That is ultimately the goal. And as you can see here, like it's kind of all over the map with regards to where our form controls are and the capabilities and customizations that we unlock. And another thing I would like to note, that this is not representing what is standardized. This is what just is representing what the web platform is. For example, many of the ones such as like range, meteor file inputs being in the limited bucket, it's solely that way because there are prefixed pseudo elements that provide some access to styling. That's actually not standardized yet, even though within the past month and a half, 2 months, we have had those discussions in the CSS working group regarding range and file for pseudo elements, for example. But then also like there's hint, and we'll start going through all of these buckets. I'm going to provide concrete examples of what they do and what they do not unlock. We'll start out with none. And this is, as you can imagine, does nothing. So basically when you insert the select, this is kind of like what applies to a lot of them today, such as like the color or the date picker or so on. So when you insert it, basically you have no control. You get what the native control looks like. So hopefully, you know, to some web developers and designers, that may be more insufficient. So like I've inserted it, I'm going to use it. You've served a subset of web developers. But as we've seen in the problem statement, unfortunately, that it doesn't necessarily go far enough. So another thing that we would like to kind of call out here is that the interop needed for this is of course none, because we can all do whatever we want in the browsers for that. The next level of customization is hint. A good example of this is actually a recent proposal from Google called Accent Color. And effectively what it's trying to do is allow the web developer or designer to provide a hint to the browser that says, hey, if you can, use this color in a meaningful way within your control. Another example, this may be like prefers color scheme, where it's like, hey, you know, I'm letting you have a hint that, hey, I would like you to render in dark controls. That doesn't like require you to, but it would be nice if you could, because it would provide a better user experience. And so ultimately what is occurring here is I've provided a blue, and this user agent here has decided to change the like arrow glyphs and the border and the gradient of the pop-up to be that blue. Now, because of the fact that it's just a hint, the user agent can do whatever they want. Again, to some web developers, this may be more than sufficient, but as we saw in some of the examples that Melanie was pointing to, it was like even down to the minute like statement. I actually loved the two examples of the selects with the arrows, because the primary thing I could see the difference of between those is like drop shadow on the pop-up and literally the width of the arrow glyph. Like the glyph itself seemed very similar. It was just one was wider and one was narrower. And so you can kind of see like the level of, well, no, mine needs to, you know, have a 45-degree angle versus a 30-degree angle, and in order for my arrow to be sufficient. And that leads us into the limited bucket. And this is the one that I find, I would say, we're more accustomed to in the CSS working group personally. And it's because of the fact that pseudo elements basically fall within this bucket. So let's say we wanted to tackle the problem of being able to change the arrows in some meaningful way, or be able to style them. Like, technically, the implementation of the styling of every pseudo element can be of varying degree, and that's kind of what I'm about to show. But let's say we wanted to unlock that capability. We first would need to go standardize the part, right? We need to go say, this part exists, it serves this function. Here is what it's going to be able to do. This is exactly what we just went and did for the file input, and are currently exploring with the range input. And so basically what we then can do is say, okay, well, what use cases exist for a web developer or designer? And what are the trade-offs? Because we're in a limited scenario here. We can't just like, you know, pretend it's a div and allow them to have full control in this scenario. And because of this, we end up saying, okay, well, let's just say a author just wants to change colors. They love the arrows. They really love them. Okay, we can go, cool. Let's just say then that everybody within this part is going to implement via an SVG, at which point fill will work on them. And so we'll update the glyphs for the fill to represent that. And so here I've been able to change the arrows to match my brand. I've been able to change the background to match what I want it to look like. and so on. But basically what you then quickly hit is, what if I wanted the arrow to actually look nothing like those arrows? Like I didn't like those arrows. I wanted the white and the blue, yeah, but I have a very specific arrow for my brand, as Melanie showed earlier in those other two selects. I'm now out of luck, and literally due to that, I'm now going to go build all of my own select just so I can use my specific asset for the drop down arrow that is used across my brand and company. And so we could then say, okay, well, to solve that problem, we're going to actually just say it's a background image asset so that anybody can replace the arrow. Technically at that point, they can change the color as well, and maybe go a little bit further in any graphical way they want to go about achieving this. The negative downside is you don't have the simplicity that we had prior before, where it's like, if I just want to change the colors, like I don't want to open Photoshop. I'm not that type of, designer or whatnot, but I want to be able to change the color. I now have to go create that asset, which is, so basically you're always doing those trade-offs within limited. Another aspect that I think is worth really pointing out is you never get to control your parent in this scenario. So anything that like you may want to like do with regards to layout, it has to work within the layout that you happen to be running within. Or if you want to maybe like bust outside of something, like you may be in an overflow hidden scenario where maybe you can't necessarily get outside of that. And so like, again, you're ultimately limited to like the constraints that are here. So why are we not able to do this today? Well, we haven't standardized the parts. We haven't gone through and standardized the parts. We haven't done the work necessary in order to go through and figure out what are the use cases we want to unlock and disable by defining what properties are or are not capable of being supported. We may be able to do that in a generalized manner, but we haven't actually taken that approach. And that's kind of, again, where if we're going to say, yes, let's unlock all the parts via pseudo element styling, let's do that in a holistic manner, taking in all the different use cases to make something that makes sense. One thing, hopefully, that you saw on that initial slide as well is that ultimately, due to the fact that things are all over the map, like none of this is deterministic. So it makes learning the platform very, very, very confusing. So if we end up having one glyph used a background image, so you can replace it, and another one as an SVG, so it's a fill, it's very like, it's very confusing for a web developer to know what they can and can't do with a control. And so we really need to be thinking about it in a holistic manner. So what we would need to be able to do is, in order to do this, we would need to be able to go define all the parts and define those things. So which is a decent amount of work, but we would need to go about doing it. The next bucket is fully stylable. And looking at this select, basically it's the same select as before. I've been able to adjust the arrow and the background there. And then I have a list of options in the pop-up, but I'm basically showing kind of a hover effect of, basically the active element that I'm over top of. It has kind of like a magnified. So Aaron Reed's name in this case happens to be much larger than others. It's bolded. But the interesting aspect and why I kind of love this example is because it seems so simple. It seems so simple, is that the options border box actually breaks outside of its containing block and has like a drop shadow on it. And while it seems simple, you currently can't do this today. And why can we not do this today? Because the list box of the part, again, is missing. Like I can't touch that part. I can't like add a drop shadow to that part, unfortunately, right now if I wanted to, because of the fact I can't touch it. The list box currently doesn't allow overflow. So even though I wanted to achieve this look, and it's a very, very, very simple look, like it's a very simple look, I can't achieve it because of the fact that I am bound to the dimensions in the window that that whoever actually owns that list box has done. And again, I'm kind of hitting on that limited. That's technically what limited allows me to do. Option elements fit into the limited bucket. I can do some, but nowhere near what web developers need within option elements. And then option elements don't allow layout changes. So effectively, like me making this width wider and repositioning margins and heights and all that wonderful stuff, you can't do currently with option elements. So in order to do this, this is where things kind of like get very interesting, and I look forward to the discourse around this. In order to achieve this and achieve this in a meaningful and holistic and in a like very ergonomic way, you end up having to standardize all the parts. So basically take limited and then kind of add this. Okay, so like we've now got all the parts defined. That then will allow us to say, okay, now we're going to go define a DOM structure, and then we're going to standardize a base set of styles. And the interoperability needed here is very, very high. So basically it enables though what web developers ultimately want, and they'll be able to achieve this styling capability in a proposal that you'll see shortly. Fully extensible. This kind of builds on top of fully stylable. But you'll notice, for example, like not only do we've taken that same example of contacts, but we've been able to like do some content replacement here, for example. So within the options, we now have like more complex layout here. We kind of basically, you can imagine doing this with like a CSS grid, because we now have the contact's image, their name and their title. But then up above in the input, we actually, in the button, we now have like Aaron, who is currently selected, his image actually breaks outside of that input. That goes back to like, you can't achieve that within just a limited design. And so ultimately, like we want to be able to make this fully extensible, do content replacement. And so currently, you're not able to do arbitrary content within an option. And then also currently everything that's within fully stylable is not possible here. So you can't fully extend the select that is currently here. But let's say you wanted to take that one step further. So in this scenario, we took basically what was in fully stylable and we took it a step further. The web developer and designer and the use case that's there, they want 70% of what is actually built into the default select, but just the top part. They don't want it to just be a button. They want it to be a text input that you're actually typing within. And as you select somebody, it actually adds their name kind of like in a tagging manner, to where their name ends up there with a little X. You can like click it, or you can press delete and it will delete the person. Basically think, yeah, you know, a common scenario is like your email case, which is actually kind of where this is taken from. Basically that is just a select. It's a multi-select in most cases that allows you to have this type input that you're making a selection for. And again, this is kind of where I point to back to the MVC model of the model isn't changing. The controller code is slightly changing in that top piece, but we don't necessarily want all the states and the behaviors to change in the bottom piece. And so while allowing this content replacement, this becomes very powerful. Why are we not able to do this today? Well, we don't have those same parts defined. But once we have those parts and the DOM structure defined, we can then also define the states, and we can define specific behaviors that are tied to those states, which unlocks all of this power. It enables that, and Melanie will get into this further when we get into the proposal for full extensibility. So ultimately, if we were going to put definitions on each of these buckets, none basically, as you can imagine, it's you know, allows the author to provide a value that the UA applies, and basically we duplicated it there. None actually does nothing, so that's actually incorrect. That is actually the definition for a hint. Need to go back and fix that up. But basically, yeah, a hint allows the author to provide a value that the UA applies to in the way that the UA feels makes sense for their given implementation. Limited is potentially CSS pseudo elements, HTML elements, or attributes, basically, that provide some type of customization over the control, but you're limited because they can't guarantee enough of the surrounding structure of the implementation in order to give you full control. Full stylability effectively allows an author opt-in that then comes with part standardization, base style, and DOM structure standardization. And due to that, you then are able to unlock that styling capability that limited can't offer, unfortunately. But it also unlocks more use cases, thus will allow more web developers to leverage it. And then full extensibility basically builds on all of those, and it's a standardization of the controls anatomy, states, behaviors, which then allows you to re-leverage that controller code and the model in order to adjust the view to your need by hooking into various aspects. So let's quickly get into, like, I feel like we kind of already have proposals for hints. We have some proposals for limited. We really want to talk about this, like the further end of the spectrum here that unlocks the majority of the use cases. So we want to talk about, solving fully stylable controls. And so if we go back to the model definition from earlier of the model controller view, ultimately what we're trying to do with fully stylable is, let's not recreate it all. Let's just allow them to adjust the view, the styles of the view as much to where they see fit without having to recreate all of it. And basically, how do we get from the select, that is just none, like this is what I get out of the box, to what I need for my use case here? How can I get to that? And effectively what we're proposing to introduce is something called the custom attribute. And so if we have select, this is what select looks like today. We have the select element with some options underneath of it. What we're proposing, as you saw in the buckets before for fully stylable, when you add the custom attribute, you end up getting the standardized DOM structure and the part definitions. This is currently using web component terminology to leverage that previous standard design. And so basically right now you can see within the select now, we have a part of button container. We have a part of selected value. We then have a div of part list box container, which then contains the options. This then gives us the opportunity to be able to touch all of these parts as a web developer and be able to style them accordingly. But even more powerful for us as web platform standards and implementers, it allows us to put together a structural CSS, basically a base set of styles that basically say, now that we've got all the parts defined, we can then say, hey, you know what, this state, it needs to be in the open position, which means this. For the majority of use cases, you know, it is a vertical set of options, so we're gonna lay it out in this manner. And so basically you can imagine something along this lines of existing within that base style sheet of a select with the attribute of custom. You know, styles go in here in this exact scenario. Basically it's a display not on the list box, for example, but then the styles can change for a select custom open. And so like in this case, we happen to show, hey, the pop-up is now open, for example. And how we want to go about standardizing that as a different discussion. It's just more of, we can put these things in there because when you go look at all the use cases, they heavily overlap. Like there is a cow path to trot here. And then while it seems like, again, we're proposing something that is new and groundbreaking, we're actually not. We're actually just evolving this. Because technically in WebKit Appearance, it actually defines just this, which is UA should include in their user agent style sheet rules to give widgets a recognizable shape when appearance is none. And what that means is there is an expectation that a control, such as a select, for example, if you go apply appearance none or all unset, and also stated in appearance none, to a select, like it still does exactly what I just showed. Like it removes all of the styles and the built-in capabilities, but the behaviors are there. But because we haven't gone and defined all of the other parts, you no longer can actually go touch those. And there's an important aspect to also understand about this, is that by us going and defining those, it's very important because of the way that you can decide how to stack names on top of each other in the list box scenario. We could do that with block. We could do that with grid. We could do that with flex. We could if we wanted to. We probably wouldn't ever, but we could do that with a table if we wanted to. And so it's very important for that structural CSS to be defined and interoperable, because if, as we saw in the problem statement that Melanie went over, not everybody's testing every browser. So if we don't agree on that and somebody opens up their list box and they decide and that browser happens to be in a display flex and they decide, hey, okay, I'm gonna make this a flex direction of row rather than a flex direction of column, they then go in and they say, okay, I assume that works everywhere. And then another browser happens to say, well, no, I laid mine out via grid, so flex direction has no impact. And now technically it's broken in there. And that's kind of what she was trying to point to, of like, that kind of is how things are today. Like certain pseudo elements allow you to do certain things while others don't. And so we're just kind of like, let's just go throw these in there and add them, but like to what level? Like there's gonna still be interop issues and we can't necessarily pretend they're not gonna be there just because we added a pseudo element. And one final thing that I want to hit on is this is actually, again, a path that has already kind of been trod, both in the component land, but also just what happened with Chromium and Edge. So Chrome and Edge in the Chromium project was basically, hey, like our controls are the same thing, basically. The behaviors and the states and the controller code are the same thing. And so ultimately what we want to be able to do is leverage as much of it as possible. So we're going to have a base style sheet. And on top of that, downstream, when we go decide to actually ship Edge or Chrome, like we're gonna have our user agent style sheet that adjusts that to see fit. So whether you like want on a, you know, in a responsive web design, you want to show a scroll wheel, you can do that because the model and the controller code overall should not be adjusting because you're just scrolling through a scroll wheel versus maybe through a box that doesn't look like a scroll wheel on desktop. So ultimately, it is not something new. Again, this is something in component libraries, this is something what web browsers are actively experimenting with as well. We just actually need to do it holistically in a standardized way. I am now going to pass it off to Melanie to tackle solving fully extensible controls.
Awesome, thanks, Greg. And if we skip right to the next slide, we will, oh, one back. There you go. Just want to revisit really quickly our good old friend, the MVC model. So again, we're really focused on enabling authors to extend the view. We think that like if we want this to be truly, fully extensible, it should be possible also to, make some tweaks to the controller code. But today we're going to really focus in on that view extensibility. So next slide. So there's a couple different ways that we imagine a web developer might extend the view here. So let's say, for example, we've unlocked full styling capabilities, and for most of the control, the author is fine with just providing different font, different color, scheme, different glyph for the arrow in the select box. But actually, like the part that they really want to like extend the DOM structure is in the list box portion. So here we have options that have like an image and a name and a title and an online status, for example. So the author can simply replace the list box slot with their own, kind of code snippet here. And this replaces the list box part of this control and just allows all the other parts of the control to work as, as defined already. So those will get the fallback, DOM structure, the parts that the web developer did not replace. Next slide. But we imagine there's also use cases where the author is like, you know what, I really just want like complete control over the entire view. I just like want my own DOM structure. I do still want, all of the model goodness. I want the controller code to still kind of, talk between my view and the model and like update things as needed. So this person can replace the entire view with their own shadow DOM. So using the attached shadow method, they can supply their own template. But what is really important here is that core parts of the author's shadow DOM must be labeled with the part attributes. So things like part button, part list box. And this will give the controller code a clear signal as to like, okay, like how am I like wiring up these, interactions with this like custom view. Next slide. So in both of the examples that I, kind of laid out here, either, the part replacement via slots or the full like shadow DOM replacement, the controller code is still like really helping the web developer leverage the web platform. So it can inform the model of user interactions with the view. So for example, the selected option in the select, it can apply the right intrinsic accessibility semantics. So, part appropriate roles, states, properties, that sort of thing. And it can wire up the correct behaviors. So we're talking here about like keyboard interactions for opening and closing, the select pop-up, traversing through the options, dismissing that pop-up, all those behaviors. And in order for the controller code to actually be able to do this, we have to standardize on several different things. So next slide. Oh, and I should mention before we go on to standardization that we actually have lots and lots more detail about these ideas for full extensibility and how we arrived at them in the enabling custom control UI explainer. So if you want to read up more, that'll be available. But anyway, let's get on to the standardization work on the next slide. So first of all, this requires, standardized DOM structure. We need to define an anatomy here. If a web developer is going to go around like replacing slots, then those need to be like unpredictable like spots, unpredictable trees. They need to understand like how these slots relate to each other. Next slide. And the author also has to have like predictable, states that have been standardized, such as like the open state or any, validation. And next slide. And then finally, to really get, that behavior for free from the platform, well, we have to standardize the behavior. So how do we actually change between states? Like what user interactions actually make that work? How are parts of the control dismissed? What are like the type ahead sort of behaviors, for example, in the select? So, all of the kind of verbiage that I'm showing here is, a lot of research that's been done on the select control in the OpenUI project. Next slide. And so we've laid out like several different buckets of things that really need to be standardized in order for us to like make, unlock these, great use cases. So I'd like to kick it back over to Greg to talk about, how might we go about standardizing? You're muted, my friend.
The little bar, it's hard for it to come back up. And now I'm it's gonna keep going because I have to click that, man. This is great. Anyways, but yeah, thank you for that, Melanie. Basically, one thing that I think has been so interesting while we've investigated this, much in the same way that the style and parts are kind of all over the map with what they're defined and to what extent they're defined. Interestingly enough, behaviors, I think it's easy for people to say, oh, well, we shouldn't standardize behaviors or something of that nature. That likewise isn't necessarily true. There are controls like the one that I think is probably closest is actually detail summary, which actually gets into defining anatomy. You could actually even look at select an option similarly as like there's an expectation of the option only like has meaning in certain contexts. And it's because of that parent element that understands it in order to create the controller code to handle it. It's just currently not defined. Detail summary goes a little bit further and says, hey, I have an open state, and then it's listening for events on the summary in order to determine which ones are open or closed, and basically spins up microtasks. It then just unfortunately doesn't go that next step and say, hey, we're now going to define the different parts that need to exist outside of details and summary. And so what we ended up with were a bunch of, again, proprietary prefixes that hopefully everybody happens to standardize on, through just practice in hopes to be able to unlock that capability for web developers. So I really want us to have a holistic approach. So the second that anybody comes in and thinks or comes up with an idea that is about UI, that is about the behaviors, the anatomy, and the states, like there is a known process that everybody across all of the working groups, whether it be ARIA, whether it be WhatWig, whether it be the CSS working group, everybody just knows like this is how going and defining a control and component goes about. And so like basically I'm actually kind of like, here's the world as it is today. Basically we have a bunch of component libraries of top web properties, small web properties, third-party component libraries, but also browser vendors do the same work. And effectively you end up with a design. A design is brought forth and effectively what ends up happening is this is then taken, and the person that's getting the joy of going to implement this on browsers is going and looking at a bunch of different things. They're trying to figure out like, what is the way that I can adhere to this design while ensuring that I create and provide as best a user experience as I can. Like nowhere along that spectrum, nor the designers or developers that are building this are sitting there going, I want to provide a bad experience. But unfortunately, the web platform is just riddled with foot guns when it comes to controls. And so unfortunately, we help propagate this problem. And so they go read different specifications. They read the ARIA best practices. They maybe look at like recommendations from the CSS working group or WhatWig within the author notes. And then of course they also Stack Overflow, Twitter, the Smashing Mag, all the CSS tricks, all the different places that you can go to for best practices. They bring all of that together and they compose it all together to ultimately produce something that most people refer to as a blueprint. And it's that composition that comes together that ultimately is saying what a select is. It's not just like a semantic meaning of what a select is. All of these things together, the user experience represented in that blueprint is what a select is for that given browser, for that given vendor, for their users. Unfortunately, again, what's interesting is in certain of these companies over here on the left, user research is also done, or they get feedback from users of like, hey, here's a reason why your tab or your select unfortunately doesn't work well for me. And unfortunately, due to the fact that it's all siloed, that knowledge may be lost unless they happen to go write it in a major publication where that is found. And so basically what we're talking about trying to do to try to solve this holistic approach is kind of flipping it on its head, recognizing that all the component libraries and design systems are actually already doing all of this work already. That was one thing that we noticed when we were working on the Chromium controls, was we were asking questions that had nothing to do with the web platform. Like they were not questions that were, hey, how does the web engine work, and like whether or not this should be multi-presses, not multi-presses. Does the rendering pipe like make this handle? No, we were asking questions like, okay, so we have a file input. Should you get 1 tabs or 2 when there's a button inside of it? That isn't a question that we're the only ones asking. Every single component and design system out there is asking the same questions, as I have the ARIA working group. This is not something that we should be like pretending that the web development platform is the only one that's having to solve this problem. As such, OpenUI was spun up literally for the same reason, because component library authors and design systems realize that they're duplicating work. And so basically prioritize and get in these blueprints, work on them together, share that knowledge, get out of the silos, produce these blueprints together. Where possible, identify problem spaces that can be platform primitives that can be brought into the web platform, whether it improves performance, improves the developer ergonomics. Ultimately, some of these blueprints should end up as like potentially new elements. But ultimately, what I would be proposing is that the primitives are defined where we would expect the primitives to be defined. It would be the ARIA working group if there's new roles. We actually had a discussion about this for the skeleton component recently, and they provided great feedback on the reason of why a skeleton role shouldn't need to exist, which was perfect. It was a great example of component library authors saying this is a very common component. We can't define a full anatomy for it, but we can provide accessibility guidance on this common scenario. And we thought it might be worthwhile to have a role of just skeleton, but it was like, no, if you actually tie these two together, it actually has the same semantic meaning as what you're proposing skeleton to be. And it's like, okay, cool. So like we can now help others with that insight. Likewise, if we find pseudo classes or pseudo elements that need to be created, we would pass that over to the CSS working group to define new elements, attributes, or events that need to exist. What way? Ultimately, what we're proposing, though, is that the blueprint, the composition of all of those things, the anatomy, the states, the behaviors, all of those that come together that truly represent this control, those be defined within OpenUI, incubated there, worked with the component libraries and authors to leverage their expertise and others to ultimately go implement against this. So similar, just like Office or Salesforce may go implement against OpenUI and ship in a component library all written in JavaScript. Likewise, Chrome can go implement against the same Microsoft Edge, Firefox, any browser vendor can go implement against this, again, and have that one blueprint in one spot, provide feedback on why it didn't work out well, user feedback, so on, and ultimately land up on a blueprint that everybody can go look at. So if they do need to make small modifications to Melanie's statement of just, slight extensibility, you have to have that fully standardized in a meaningful way so you can override that JavaScript behaviors or those slots, like put in the different slots in order to make that happen. So it's a lot of information we ran through as hopefully we kind of hit on early on. We kind of wanted to paint the entire forest, the problem, the spectrum of ways in which we could try to solve that problem. Nothing along that spectrum is inherently bad, but ultimately you do end up unlocking more and more web developers being able to leverage your experience as you go along that spectrum. And so we wanted to show the entire forest, but now we actually do want to dig into the individual trees and talk about them. Unfortunately, for those of you watching on the video, we will not be having a discussion between Melanie and I on every single one of them, seeing as how we've already worked on proposing them together. We've discussed this quite a bit. But we will follow up with the minutes from the discussion that happened on October 12th, 2020. So that you can see how the discussion went, and hopefully we'll make some progress on having holistic solutions to styling and extending of built-in form controls. So thanks for watching.
Thanks for joining us.
Bye.